So we're live now. It's a pleasure to welcome Karoline to our Colloquium series. Karoline is a professor of complexity science at the University of Potsdam and also external faculty in the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna. She has a PhD in physics from Uppsala University, and she was postdoc at the Santa Fe Institute and UC Davis. Before joining as full professor this year at Potsdam University, she was faculty at the University of Bristol, and she has a recent book on applied information theory and foundations of complexity. So that was published last year, so it's also highly recommendable. And Karoline, it's a pleasure to listen to your talk, which I understand you will mention philosophical foundations and applications to climate and social science.
That's right. Thank you very much, Carlos, for the kind introduction and for the invitation. I feel honored to be part of this series. Let me share my screen and then we'll kick it off. Okay, right. Yes, indeed. As Carlos says, I will be talking about foundations of complexity science, and I will bridge the gap all the way to applications in climate and in social or socio-economic, ecological systems. Now, I'm not going to tell you what complexity is, because you will all know what complexity is. So I'm speaking here to an audience that doesn't need an introduction to that topic. Instead, what I want to do is give you a clear framework that makes it precise, all the bits and pieces that we know about complexity, phenomena in complex systems, and so on. That's basically the subject of the book that Carlos kindly mentioned. And that's a big part of my talk, is this framework, which I'll present to you. And then we work our way through to the application areas. So let me see. Right. So what is a complex system? I like to quote Sean Carroll, who is a physicist at Caltech, who says, many people might not bother to define complexity, thinking that we know it when we see it. Scientists and philosophers have no such luxury. That's precisely the starting point of the work I'll present to you today. We all know it when we see it, and of course, as a complexity scientist, we know more than that. And yet, defining it is something we shy away from, because we think we don't really need to do that. And I disagree with that. I agree with Sean Carroll. So let me give you an idea of where I think still today many scientists are in their understanding of complexity. And this is a special edition from the Science Journal. It's now more than 20 years old, but I think it still represents the current situation. So Goldenfeld and Kadanoff, famous statistical physicists, say, to us, complexity means that we have structure with variation. Another quote in that issue is, a complex system is one whose evolution is very sensitive to initial conditions or to small perturbations, one in which the number of independent interacting components is large. So the first statement, we can hardly disagree with, but does it really help is the question. I'd say it doesn't. And the second one represents a confounding with chaos theory, which happens quite often. And in my view, these two need to be separated. And here's another quote. The adjective complex describes a system or a component that by design or function or both is difficult to understand and verify. Again, that's a quote or a statement that we can hardly disagree with, but is it helpful? Not really. And another one is complexity theory indicates that large populations of units can self-organize into aggregations that generate patterns, store information, and engage in collective decision-making. I'd say this one gets closer to what I would view as the topic of complexity science. And it mentions already buzzwords like self-organization, pattern formation. And the last example of a quote, a complex system is literally one in which there are multiple interactions between many different components. And this as well, I'd say, gets closer to what we think is actually important in a complex system. So the idea is to extract what is really relevant in these quotes and what is not helpful, and make that into a rigorous framework for discussing complexity. So the work that I'm presenting here, and which is some of it is in the book, is work done with my colleague James Ladyman, who is a philosopher of science, and he's also trained as a mathematician and a physicist. So he knows the natural sciences very well. And we decided to start out with stating the obvious. And I've learned that from science, philosopher of science, that it seems like not really necessary, but it helps. So we begin by stating the truisms of complexity that we believe everybody in this field agrees. And so far, we haven't heard that anybody disagrees. So the first one is more is different. Non-living systems can generate order. Complexity can come from simplicity. Coordinated behavior does not require an overall controller. Complex systems are often modeled as networks or information processing systems. There are various kinds of invariants and forms of universal behavior in complex systems. Complexity science is computational and probabilistic. Complexity science involves multiple disciplines. There is a difference between the order that complex systems produce and the order of the complex systems themselves. So you can see that some of these statements are about the subject of complexity. Some of them are about the practice of complexity science. So we take this as a starting point as agreed upon. And just to illustrate truism 5, complex systems are often modeled as networks. You can pick, these days, you can pick pretty much any subject in the natural sciences and even now in the social sciences, quite a few, and you'll find studies that involve the mathematical object of a network, of a graph. Truism 6, just to illustrate that briefly, there are various kinds of invariances and universal behaviors. Power law behavior is one example. You find it across so many different kinds of natural systems that definitely counts as a universal behavior. Okay. Now we're coming to the more difficult part, which is talking about the definition of complexity. And I want to quote Phil Anderson, who says in his famous paper, More is Different, in all complex systems, the whole displays behavior that the individual parts cannot. This is called emergence. And many would say emergence, well, a system is complex if there is emergence. And to me, that doesn't seem to help very much because the two are almost interchangeable. So if you know what emergence is, you know what complexity is. If you know what complexity is, you know what emergence is. But instead, if we split this up into, well, what is really emerging? I think then we can get a bit closer to an answer. So the emergent features of complexity are 4 properties, 4 features that my colleague James and I have distilled, if you like, from all the different works and writings on the subject. And they are spontaneous order and self-organization, non-linearity, robustness, and nested structure. And why are we listing them here? Because each one of them very often is, if you like, the hallmark. We see it, we see self-organization, we know, oh, this is a complex system, right? And the difference between just talking about emergence and talking about spontaneous order or self-organization is that it's much more precise, the latter one, and we can start actually measuring it, okay? Measuring emergence is not really possible. Measuring order is possible, right? Similarly, nested structure, we can start measuring, the number of levels, for example. Okay, And I'm just checking that the Zoom is still working. It is? Okay, good. Now, those were the emergent properties, and they are, if you like, the I know it when I see it. But then the question is, what makes these properties arise? What makes this emergence arise? And there we go down, if you like, one level below and ask, what are the conditions for complexity? And here, again, coincidentally, we have 4 such conditions. The first one is numerosity. There are many elements and there are many interactions between these elements. That is the condition for complexity, I would say. And it was in one of the quotes that we had in the beginning. Then there is disorder and diversity, slightly different things, though mathematically actually pretty much the same, which means there is stochasticity in that system. There is noise, randomness. That is always the case. Feedback, that makes it interesting. So feedback is when these many interactions between these many parts actually have an impact on each other, or a future impact. Past behavior has an impact on future interactions. Without feedback, I don't think there can be any structure formation. And then the non-equilibrium, non-equilibrium is a term from physics, and you can also think about it as the systems always being open. So there is always an influx of, it can be something physical like energy or people, but it can also be information in more abstract kinds of systems. So these 4 conditions, I would argue, we argue, are always there. And the emergent features are there when we have a complex system. Now, there are still a few ones missing, and we separate them out in this list of features because they are particularly relevant or only relevant for functional systems. And I say functional, not living systems. Living systems are also functional systems, so they're included here. But there are systems that do have a function that are not living, and particular systems that are made by living systems. So for example, the economy would be a functional system, but it's not, I would argue, it's not a living system. So these 3 features that are particularly for these functional systems are modularity, which implies functionality. And then there is history and memory, and there is adaptive behavior, of course. So those features together are the catalog of features that make a system complex. And we argue that that's a complete catalog. But so, which means that take your favorite complex system, go through your mind which of these features apply. And I promise you, you will find the features that apply to your favorite complex system. Okay, so this is, I say, quote unquote hierarchy. My collaborator is not happy with the term hierarchy, but it puts the conditions at the bottom, and then they lead to the emergent features of complexity, which include particularly those features that only functional systems have. And that's the framework I was talking about in the beginning, that we present in this book in much detail. And it leads us to give a kind of a definition, which I offer here. A system is complex if it has some or all of, and then I'm listing all the emergent features that I've just presented to you: spontaneous order, self-organization, nonlinear behavior, robustness, history, memory, nested structure, modularity, and adaptive behavior. Then these features arise from the combination of what I call the conditions of complexity: numerosity, disorder, diversity, feedback, and non-equilibrium. And then naturally there are different kinds of complex systems, because some systems exhibit some but not all of the features. And this is a bit of a philosophy of science statement, where they're asking, one of the standard questions in philosophy of science is, is it a natural kind? Is it complex system a natural kind? And I'm not a philosopher, so I can't really explain that in detail to you. But we come to the conclusion from these different features that there are different kinds of complex system, and that I'm pretty sure it doesn't come as a surprise to you. So I'll shamelessly advertise this here. It is available as ebook if you like. Okay. Now, that's all good and nice. And one reason that I'm convinced this is important to state the obvious and to give a clear framework of what complexity is as a phenomenon, and it is clearly a multifaceted phenomenon, is that when we do science, we can only do it when we can measure things, right? If we can't measure it, then it's basically impossible to study. And that's true for the natural sciences for sure. So it's not surprising that the measurement of complexity is and has been a big topic for decades, and that there are still measures of complexity being invented. So here I'm just throwing on the screen here more or less randomly selected measures of complexity that are out there. So on the upper right corner, you see examples from, there's one from the economy, one from molecular biology, and then one from astronomy. And the lower three examples are all examples of complexity measures for time sequences. And probably most of the measures that are being invented for time sequences. And they're called measures of complexity. Now, just for fun, I put into Google Scholar measuring complexity, and I got back 4.5 million results. That's an incredibly crude approach to finding out about the activity in a certain field, but it gives you an idea. And we've just seen that complexity is a multifaceted phenomenon, right? So systems have, for example, nestedness, and they might have non-linearity. Well, they all will, I'm pretty sure. But not all of them might have modularity, for example. So how could you possibly measure complexity in a single number? And that's what all of these approaches do. They give you a single number for the complexity of a system. And it's clear why, because we want to measure things. But here I like to quote the late Murray Gell-Mann, who wrote, "A variety of different measures would be required to capture all our intuitive ideas about what is meant by complexity." And I wholeheartedly agree with this. Funnily enough, it didn't stop him from proposing a measure of complexity. Yeah, that's I'll get back to that actually. So I say business has been going on for decades, and I myself did some work on it during my postdoc. And I'm not saying this is all wrong, absolutely not. I just want to specify what exactly they're measuring when they say they're measuring complexity. And to give you an idea of the history, for those who don't know, there's a long history, a long list of measures that have been invented, in particular in the computational sciences, information theoretic computational sciences. There is Gell-Mann and Lloyd's effective complexity, which is based on Kolmogorov complexity of a set of an ensemble of similar systems. I'm not going to go into the detail here, but logical depth is also based on the Kolmogorov complexity. Then there is statistical complexity, which was invented twice, as far as I can tell, 2 different names, is based on the Shannon entropy. And similarly, thermodynamic depth is also based on Shannon entropy. So there's a whole book to be written about that. And what I want to do now is give you, instead of going through these purported measures of complexity in any further detail, I want to give you examples of what is actually being done in the sciences. And you might find yourself in your own field of study in this list of examples. and tell you in what way complexity, a feature of complexity, is being measured. So let's start with disorder. Some of these examples are my own work and others are not. But here I start with disorder. In this example, it's disorder in genetic expressions of a stem cell. And given the amazing technology these days where you can isolate single cells and measure the gene expression profile, we found we could measure the Shannon entropy of the gene expression profile. And we found that while the stem cell was differentiating towards a somatic cell, the disorder in the expression profile would go up. And then when it was differentiated, it had sort of made the decision it would go down again. We would certainly say that a stem cell is a complex system. I would say that. And what we measured here was not the complexity of the differentiation process, but the disorder of the gene expression profile while the cell was going through the lineage specification process. So Shannon entropy is a measure of disorder, and it's used in many cases of complex systems. Measuring feedback, so that was another one of the conditions of complexity, is not really, you wouldn't put a number on feedback. Instead, what you would do is probably you would build a model that includes feedback. And here, for example, coupled differential equation models are an obvious choice. And then you would see whether it fits the data that you have or not. And if it does, you think there's feedback in the system. Non-linearity is a very broad term, and the power law statistic is just one example of non-linearity. If you like, any correlation in the system is a kind of a non-linearity. That's how statisticians like to think about non-linearity. Then order self-organization. In fact, there are many measures of complexity that really what they do is they measure order. And then because they know something about the system, for example, they know it's self-organizing, then they say, oh, I'm measuring complexity, but really they measure order. Mutual information is a popular measure of order. It's not the only one, of course. And the example here is the mutual information in a glass forming system. So it starts out in a, if you like, in a random, in a liquid state, and then you cool it down and it doesn't crystallize, sorry, but it cools down and patterns form, structure forms, and you can measure that, and particularly the onset of it, using mutual information. It's just one example. There are plenty of them. Measuring robustness, you could say any order must, is only measurable if it is robust. So these features are not entirely separable. But here I'm trying to do that with the examples. So robustness, of course, in nonlinear dynamical systems, we have what is in the middle picture is just a representation of a system that goes through a tipping point. And you can measure how close it is to a tipping point, and a monsoon onset, which is the example I give on the right, is such a tipping point in a climate system. And the correlation function tells you how close you are to that tipping point. Measuring memory, again, that's related to information theory. So a lot of measures of complexity measure memory in the sense of, how far into the past you have to look to get a proper prediction, a good prediction of the future behavior of the system. And so hidden Markov models are often used to represent statistics of a time sequence, for example. And that is just one example of how we measure memory in a complex system. Okay. This is all summarized in one chapter of this book, which is the only mathematical chapter of the book, which is why we actually put it on the archive, edited it slightly so you can read it independently of the book. And there, we give more examples and go through some of the math in more detail. Okay. I want to make a brief comment on information theory, which is one of the main subjects of my research, and why information theory shows up often when we look at, well, models for complex systems, tools, computational tools, and measures of complexity. And on this slide, what I've done is on the right-hand side, I put all the features that I presented to you in the beginning of this, in the first part of this talk. And in orange, I put all those that you can certainly measure with information theory. So disorder, I gave you an example of that, the Shannon entropy. Diversity mathematically is the same as disorder, and you can measure it with a Shannon entropy. Self-organization, you can measure the order. Mutual information was a way to do that. Nestedness, there are clustering algorithms that use information theory. And memory is the other example I gave you. Information theory can measure that. So that's, yeah, some would ask, oh, all complex systems are information processing systems. And that's an interesting point of view. But here, all I'm saying is it's not a surprise that information theory shows up, because it provides useful tools for measuring features of complexity. Okay. Right. Now, in the second part of my talk, I want to go through two applications. And these are, the work here is quite conceptual. So I'm now going away from the mathematics and how to measure complexity. And here instead, what we were interested in doing is using these list of features of complexity and see whether that can help us tackle some interesting problems. And democratic stability is the first problem that I want to mention in this context. So what is the situation? Here is here's some data. These are from The Economist, who have their own way of measuring the democratic health of a country. And they measure it with an index that goes from 0, which means there's no democracy left, to 10, which is perfect democracy, whatever that means, right? So that we can, there's a whole discussion by itself, but we just take this as a good indicator. And not surprisingly, North Korea is at the bottom. And I just pick a few countries here. Norway, I picked it because it was actually the one that scored highest. Now there's this phenomenon of backsliding, which is quite recent. And this is countries that are really consolidated democracies, like the United States, and that seem to be sliding back on this scale of democratic health. So the United States, Poland, Hungary are 3 examples where we see that. And for political scientists, that seems, well, they've spent a lot of time asking themselves, what does it take for a country to become a democracy? And they haven't thought that much about, well, what happens once it is there, and it deteriorates. So this is a new research question for them. And as these 2 political scientists say, we lack theories to explain backsliding. After debates about democratic transitions, we haven't really thought about the reverse. Okay. And then what, in a collaboration with 9 other scientists from 5 other countries, and we have computer scientists in this collaboration, physicists, political scientists, philosophers, economists. So it's been really a very colorful group of people. And we try to understand, what can complexity say about a democracy? Why would it be sensible to take that point of view? And I'm picking here 3 quotes again from papers that illustrate the connection between the democracy as a system and complex systems. So the first one is from a political scientist from the UK, David Runciman, who says the randomness of democracy, which remains its essential quality, protects us against getting stuck with truly bad ideas. I really like this quote because you could equally talk about optimization algorithms where you're trying to find a minimum, and if you do it in a stochastic way, you're more likely to find an optimal point in your potential landscape. And it's the same with finding a solution in the democracy. Then there's another quote by Page and Gillens, who say the health of democracy and the extent of economic inequality have tended to rise and fall together. So there's clearly feedback happening here, very visible. And it's just that conceptually we can say that disorder and feedback are two important properties for good or for bad in a democratic system. And the last one, by Farrell and Cosmo Schlesi, who some of you will know. Some degree of diversity and partisan disagreement in a democracy is healthy and even necessary. That's similar to saying randomness is important, disagreement is important. So in this paper here, what we do is we extract notions of stability, and we then talk about how that matches with the complexity science view. And then we asked ourselves, so what, right? That's a conceptual piece of work, and it got some attention, people liked it. But can we actually learn something for can we do something, if you like? So we wrote a second paper. Here I actually put down all the names, which I'm glad I did. Where we ask, well, once we take that point of view that a democratic system is a complex system, and we want to stabilize it, where in the first paper we clarified what it means to stabilize something which is never static. And here we use insights from network science, for example, in making suggestions of how to stabilize a country or a democracy. So 3 examples from that work are entrenched diversity. If diversity is so important, you need to make sure that it's there and not a single, very homogeneous group gets to make all the decisions. And citizen assemblies are really popping up worldwide. It's very interesting. Feedback, for good or for bad. But if you monitor it, especially the feedback between economic inequality and a lack of influence on political decisions is important. And then ensuring connectivity. Once the system breaks apart, then you also preventing it from communication, feedback, and so on. So that's an attempt conceptually to link the foundations of complexity science with a very topical political question. Now, I want to use the last 5 minutes or so in talking about the second example, which again is conceptual. And the hope is that the next step would then be to quantify it. And it is work on climate mitigation and adaptation projects. So it's work that I did together with the Green Climate Fund. And the Green Climate Fund is it's a very complicated way of describing an operating entity of the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC. And what it is really, in 2014 at the IPCC meeting, they decided they need to help the developing world to cope with climate change. And so they set up a financial mechanism to fund projects that do that. And it's a huge investment. So the total financing, this is, I think, a year old, 5.2 billion, and they were granted another 5 billion, I believe, last year. So massive effort. And the idea was, well, can complexity science, contribute something here? I like to quote Elinor Ostrom here, the economist, who said, we should stop striving for simple answers to solve complex problems. And basically what we did for the Green Climate Fund was, using her work, which was a way of categorizing, if you like, social ecological systems. There were many papers where this is being explained and then used and developed further, but this is probably one of the first ones in 2009. And we built on this in taking this as our complex system. So you can already see that we have many players, many interactions, we have levels of players, because of course a governance system then consists of, you know, subunits, and at some point you get to the actual people who are involved in it. You have interactions between these systems. You have it, the system is open. So this graphic is from Ostrom's paper, but you can beautifully describe it as a complex system because it's open to, of course, the climate, so the conditions from the outside, political conditions, anything else economic that is impacting on the system, but the system itself doesn't necessarily have any impact on in return. And we looked at individual projects of the Green Climate Fund. So here is an example of a project that we looked at a bit more closely, sustainable landscapes in eastern Madagascar. And we wanted to know, can we learn something from this list of features of complexity about that project that helps them to optimize the project in terms of its probability of success. And I'm just giving you a very rough overview here. But one thing that we did is we asked, okay, what are the players here? What are the interactions between the players? And the graphic here, you might not be able to read all the little words here. It doesn't matter. But the graphic tells us different kinds of interactions that we have. So between, for example, governance and ecosystem, or everything that's in red is the climate that's impacting on the system. And that's the first step. And the second step, we're asking, so what does a Green Climate Fund do when it intervenes into these systems? And we can already see, just by looking at this image, all the green arrows and the green patches are interventions, that we're making a system which is, you know, it's already consisting of a lot of elements and players, even more so when we add these interventions. And then staying on this conceptual level, we just went through the features, complexity features, number of elements, number of interactions, diversity, feedback, adaptive behavior even, and trying to assess them and measure them in a way, a very crude way, non-linearity, memory, nestedness, and openness. And adding these into a scoring of, and now we actually do have a single number of complexity, which I don't claim is well, certainly not unique. And it's based on many assumptions by many people and assessments of experts and so on. So it's not a physical measurement per se. But for that community, this way of looking at a system was already way more detailed than they had ever done before. So for me as a physicist, it was a very interesting experience in, you know, you have to lean out the window quite a lot because you have to accept you can't simply measure things, and you can't isolate your system and put it in the lab and so on. But that the concepts themselves are applicable and they do help in understanding the inner workings of a system as big as such a climate mitigation project. And so this is hopefully just the beginning, because then you can add in, you know, proper modeling and so on. But we haven't done any of that for now anyways. So this is all published in the learning paper, which you find online by the Green Climate Fund. And also on my website, if you go there, you find it. And so I'll just come to my concluding remarks. The first part of my talk really wanted to emphasize that complexity is a multifaceted phenomenon. So we can't possibly measure it as a single phenomenon. There are many mathematical tools, and I give you some examples of tools that measure specific aspects. And they also make it clear why these tools exist, because they are able to measure specific aspects or model specific aspects. And then a last part of the talk was examples of how complexity science can provide new perspectives on social and social ecological systems. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention. And I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Caroline. There are already several questions waiting in the YouTube chat. If you have more questions, please type them quickly, and hopefully we'll have time to answer them. Well, I'll take the moderator prerogative, because I also have some questions, and I think that the definition of complexity runs into similar problems of trying to define life and intelligence and consciousness and other concepts. But I think that your proposal is interesting because traditional definitions try to be exclusive in the sense that, okay, in order to be complex or living or intelligent, you need to fulfill all of these conditions. And you are more inclusive in the sense that, well, you can be this or that, and that will give you different types of complexity. Do you think a similar approach could be taken for, well, perhaps not definitions, but at least notions of life and intelligence? I will not speculate about consciousness, but let's say living systems have several properties, but then a problem with definitions is that not all living systems have these same properties. So I don't know what you think about that.
It's a super interesting question. I hadn't thought about it that way. I usually think about it the other way around. You know, when somebody says, why do you bother? And then I say, well, we also bother trying to define life because we really need to know. Yeah. And we also accept that we can't find a, you know, clear-cut definition of what it is, because there's always a gray zone. And the same will be true for complexity. But your point of view is different, interesting. I don't have a quick answer to it, but it's certainly worth thinking about it, yeah.
Let me read a comment from Ana Teixeira. Recognizing that measuring might be important in many ways in the social sciences or in studying social systems, one might be able to understand and investigate complexity without measuring. Qualitative studies, for example, do not necessarily measure complex features in the world, but may well grasp many of them in important ways. Measuring complexity might be of less value than other ways of relating to the complexity of a system. There is more science in social complexity science than computational social science.
Okay, let me try. I didn't get all of the question, but I'll try to.
It was more of a comment that in some areas of complexity, it's not so important to have a precise measure of what's going on. But well, from what I understand, that it's more of a narrative that might be useful for understanding and studying phenomena. Yeah,
I'd say the comment I made, I certainly stand by it when it comes to the natural sciences, but it's different in the social sciences, and there's also different traditions of doing it. And I perfectly agree that insights can be gained without measuring.
Yes. Adam Castro asks, it has been stated that numerosity is a feature of complex systems, but there are some systems that tend to indetermination, self-organize, or show emergent properties starting from few elements. Could you please comment about numerosity and or modularity as a requisite for complexity?
Yes, so I'll comment on numerosity first. It leads to the question, how many is many, right? And again, there is no sharp boundary. It has to be at least 10. You know, there's no such thing. But it has to be, well, 1 is not enough, that's for sure. And 3, I doubt it. Because the question, what really has to be many is the interactions. Right? And starting from 10, you can get, you know, interactions scale much faster than the number of elements themselves. So that's really all I can say here. modularity is not a prerequisite. It exists in some systems, and I put it in the functional category because the term modularity, in my view, presumes a functionality.
Yep. Gabriel Ramos Fernandez asks, you include adaptive behavior and function as features of complex systems. Function in biology can be specified at different levels, for example, individual versus group level selection. How does complexity science contribute to a better understanding of level to ascribe function in living systems?
Well, I certainly agree with the different levels that you can have. You can choose on which some systems you can choose on which level you study them, and they will be complex on all these levels. How can complexity science contribute to understand functionality and adaptive behavior? That's a very big question. I don't really have a good, quick answer to that.
Well, I can
maybe you do,
tentatively give my answer to that. I know it was not addressed to me, but I think that complexity science is relevant when you're interested precisely about more than one level. Usually, if your description is restricted to one level, traditional approaches may or may not be sufficient, but really when complexity becomes powerful is when you are interested in how the agents or components or elements at one scale determine the behavior or properties at another scale and vice versa, because let's say it can go both ways across scales.
Yeah, I like that answer. So it's nice that there are always two levels anyways, because you're always thinking of the micro and the macro level. That's sort of a given. And then you're right. And that's when complexity science is powerful, and it can deal with more than two.
Yeah. Amaury Diaz asks, is there any notion of symmetry for complex systems? Are there some complex symmetries that characterize complex systems?
Well, what comes to mind is I recommend Phil Anderson's paper More is Different, where he speaks about the breaking of symmetry, so that you can get from one level to the next by specifically breaking a symmetry. I think it's a very interesting idea, and he discusses it in the context of molecular physics and fundamental physics, and maybe there's a way to put that forward to higher levels of the natural sciences like biology. I haven't tried that myself, but that could well be.
Yep. Alejandro Avila asks, in terms of political situation of a given country and control theory, has something of control theory or control of complex systems been applied to improve societies?
To my knowledge, not as such in this control theory way. But one way to look, if one wanted to find it, could possibly be these, these assemblies that are being created in many different countries. In Ireland, in South Korea, where you can't control the outcome of the assembly, but you can certainly you can set the framework and the modularity such that you're hoping for maximum mixing of opinions, for example, right? So and formulating that in terms of control theory, I haven't seen that. That could be an super interesting project.
Yeah, I guess it's just that the vocabulary has changed, but it reminds me of the CyberSyn project almost 50 years ago in Chile by Stafford Beer and Chilean cyberneticists. Basically, they built a nervous system for the country using telex technology, which was obsolete already at that moment.
Cool.
And let's say it helped the government of Salvador Allende to resist the strikes which were promoted by the CIA. So, for example, there was a strike of drivers, but then there were like 50 drivers which remained loyal to the regime, and they had real-time information. Every day they had information from the whole country. And of course, people say, well, in Chile it's easy because it's a linear country. You just have one main highway. But anyway, with 50
that was
drivers,
50 years ago, did you say? Or?
Yeah, 71, 72.
Wow.
and they managed to keep enough stock because they had daily information of which factories were producing what and which cities needed what and what were the requirements. So they were able to plan all the logistics for whole country. But then in 1973, with the military coup, they destroyed that, and kind of people forgot about it until recently.
Oh, wow. And something else comes to mind, which is the work by, Ian Cousin is one who does that kind of work. Just thinking of animals, shoals of fish and so on. And what does it take to, change the opinion of a whole shoal of fish? Well, it actually doesn't take, it takes about a fraction of the number to impose a change in movement.
Yes. And let's say marketologists and politicians know how to do these things, only that
that's right.
Perhaps it's not to improve societies. So it does not precisely answer the question.
No, that's true.
Yasser Cruz asks, if category theory is a synthetic approach, an object is defined by its relation, like set theory, which is analytical, are there any categorical approaches in complex systems?
I'm not aware of any. No, I'm aware of something in quantum mechanics, but not for complex systems. So doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Ana Teixeira asks, can you elaborate on your position in relation to the relevance of measuring complexity versus understanding the nature or type of and managing complexity in relation to social ecological systems?
So I'll repeat the question in the way I understand it. How relevant is it to measure complexity when it comes to social ecological systems? I would say that, certainly as a physicist, it's my ambition to quantify things. And why am I interested in that? Because if I build a model, let's say, of a social ecological system, and a model that makes a prediction, then how do I then find out whether my prediction was any good? And if I translate into numbers, then I can actually make an assessment of the goodness of my prediction. That's why I think in particular we're entering really a data, we have entered already a data age, and so we can now do that. It doesn't mean conceptual approaches are now a thing of the past, by no means, but we can complement them by quantitative models also for social ecological systems.
Yeah, I agree. You need both, because of course you need some explanation, but then you need the data in order to contrast different theories. Actually, that's one of the big leaps that say modern technology is providing, the ability to have data and models that apply to complex systems as societies, like in computational social sciences. And before, it was very difficult to contrast theories with data, because making polls and things like that is very slow and time consuming and has biases and so on. And then with the huge data deluge that we are living, suddenly you can contrast different social theories of, for example, opinion formation and things like that. So
yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Perhaps a couple of more questions. Gabriel Ramos Fernandez asks, would you include downward causation in the feedback properties of complex systems? How does a global emergent property of a system become an influence on lower levels of organization?
So the first one was downward causation.
Whether you would consider it as a feedback, and then how would that work?
Well, exactly. My question would be, how would that work? No.
Perhaps the first question should be, do you believe in downward causation?
Yeah, exactly. And no.
Okay. So then that answers the other two questions. And I have one final question. I mean, many authors have suggested that one of the features of complexity is something similar to criticality, in the sense that you have a balance between order and chaos, or adaptability and robustness. And I mean, you include robustness and you include adaptive behavior, but would you include in your framework somewhere this balance or criticality as a feature of complexity, or is just an outcome of the other functional properties that you mentioned?
I'd say it's included in, well, it's not included explicitly, of course, but like you say, there is robustness is in there, but there is no, I mean, what's not in there is a description of what makes something robust, right? So that's the question we asked for democracy, but it's being asked for so many different systems. What is it that makes something in this system robust? The structure or the functionality, whatever. And the just like structure formation is generally an interplay between this, you know, randomness, stochasticity, and the structure forming, and repair can only happen if there is stochasticity in the system. So there is already an interplay between these two. In that sense, I would say this criticality idea is in there, as in the ingredients are in the feature. But then it leaves the question open, a super interesting question. You know, how come it can balance? It can actually manage this balancing act.
Yeah, because I mean, Kaufman was writing in his book Investigations that if you have too much robustness, then you cannot adapt, because it's basically nothing changes, and that's the maximal robustness.
Yeah.
But then if you have maximal adaptivity, you have too much change, and you will lose the identity of the system. So somewhere in between those extremes, that's where complexity lies. And some measures of complexity try to capture that balance, but I guess this precise balance also changes on the context and on the environment and on the system and so on. So I guess that's something that we are still learning about.
Yeah, I agree with everything you've said, and the actual balance will be very system dependent.
Great. So, well, thank you again, Karoline. It was very interesting talk and conversation. In a couple of weeks, we'll have Melanie Mitchell. She will speak about artificial intelligence. And afterwards, we will also have Ricard Solé, Philip Ball, Jessica Flack. So please don't miss the next talks of our series. So thank